I never thought a leaky pipe under the kitchen sink would be the thing that unraveled everything. My son and his wife had left for their anniversary trip to Scottsdale on a Thursday morning. 5 days in Arizona, spa resort, golf, the whole thing. They'd been planning it for months, and honestly, I was glad for them. My son works hard. He's been working hard his whole life, and I raised him to appreciate what he has. What I didn't know was what he'd left behind. He called me the night before they flew out. Casual, easy tone. Dad, I've got a handyman coming Tuesday to fix that sink in the kitchen. The one that's been dripping since spring. I gave him your number in case he needs anything. You still have the spare key, right? I told him yes. Of course I did. I'd had a spare key to that house since the day he bought it 6 years ago. Back then it was just him, just my boy moving into his first real place after the divorce from his first wife. We'd painted the kitchen together that first weekend. Took us 2 full days and a case of beer. You need me to be there when he comes? I asked. Nah, you don't have to, Dad. He knows what he's doing. Just wanted you to know in case. I said all right. We said goodnight. That was Thursday. Tuesday came. I wasn't planning to go over. I had my own errands, a follow-up at my cardiologist, groceries, the usual slow rhythm of a retired man's week. But around 11 in the morning, my phone buzzed. A number I didn't recognize. Hello? Sir, is this Mr. Callahan? The man's voice was low, almost careful, like he was trying not to be overheard. I said yes. This is Mitch. I'm the plumber your son hired. I'm at the house right now and He stopped. I heard him exhale. Sir, I think you need to come over here. The way he said it, that pause before the word think, something in my chest went still. What's wrong? I asked. Is there a bigger problem with the pipes? Flood damage. No, sir, it's not the pipes. Another pause. There's a little girl here. In the back bedroom. The one that's locked. I was already reaching for my car keys. I don't remember the drive clearly. I remember the traffic light on Garfield, staying red for what felt like 3 minutes. I remember gripping the steering wheel with both hands even though I haven't needed to do that since I was 17. I remember thinking, there must be an explanation. There has to be an explanation. Mitch was standing in the front doorway when I pulled up. He's a big man, broad-shouldered, the kind of guy you'd want around in a tight spot. But he looked shaken. He stepped aside without a word and pointed down the hall. The door at the end. My son's home office, or what used to be his home office, had a sliding board on the outside. Brand new. Still had the hardware store sticker on the bracket. I stood there for a moment, just looking at it. Then I slid the board. She was sitting on the floor in the far corner, knees pulled to her chest, eyes wide. 7 years old, maybe 8. Dark hair, thin arms. She was wearing a pink shirt with a cartoon cat on it that was at least 2 sizes too small. There was a sleeping bag rolled out near the wall, a small lamp plugged in by an extension cord, and a plastic bin with a lid that I later found out was being used as a bathroom because the room had no access to one. On the floor beside her, an empty bag of pretzels, 3 juice boxes, all empty, and a granola bar she hadn't opened yet. She looked at me the way animals look at you when they don't know yet if you're going to help or hurt. I crouched down, slowly, the way I used to do when my son was small and he'd had a nightmare. Hey there, I said. My name is Walter. What's your name? She didn't answer right away. Her eyes went to Mitch behind me, then back to me. Iris, she finally said, just above a whisper. Hi, Iris. Are you hungry? The way her face changed at that question. That's something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. I found out later she'd been in that room for 4 days. Her name was Iris Penelope Callahan, my daughter-in-law's daughter from her first marriage. I had met the child exactly 3 times. Once at the wedding, once at Christmas 2 years ago, once briefly when I dropped something off at the house and she'd been in the yard. My son had never spoken about her much. I'd assumed she spent most of her time with her father. I'd assumed a lot of things. While Mitch sat in the kitchen and I got Iris a glass of milk and the last of some crackers I found in the pantry, she talked. Slowly at first, then faster, the way kids do once they realize someone is actually listening. Her dad, my daughter-in-law's ex-husband, had moved to Portland 2 years ago. He had a new girlfriend, a new baby. He called on birthdays. Sometimes. She'd been living in that house full-time for almost a year. She told me that the room happened gradually. First, she got moved out of the guest bedroom because they needed it for something else. Then she was sleeping on the couch. Then, about 6 weeks ago, the office became her room. Her stepfather, my son, had put a lock on it, she said, because she kept wandering around at night. She was 7 years old. She was wandering around at night because she was a child. Because children do that. Because no 7-year-old should be locked in a room by a bolt on the outside of the door. I called 911 from the kitchen. I told Mitch he didn't have to stay, but he did. He sat at that kitchen table and didn't say a word, and I was glad for his company. The officers came. Then a woman from Child Protective Services, a calm and thorough woman named Miss Patterson, who had clearly done this work long enough to know how to be gentle without being fragile. She spoke with Iris for a long time. She spoke with me. She took photographs of the room, the bolt, the empty food wrappers. I called my son. It was around 2 in the afternoon in Arizona. He picked up on the second ring, sounding easy and relaxed, the sound of a man sitting beside a pool. "Hey, Dad, everything okay?" "No," I said. "It's not. You need to come home." Silence. "What happened? Is the sink worse than we thought? Did Mitch find something?" "There's a police officer standing in your kitchen," I said. "And your stepdaughter has been locked in a room for 4 days with no proper food and no bathroom. And I'm trying very hard right now to stay calm while I talk to you." The silence that followed was different from the first one. Dad, don't," I said. "Just come home. I want to tell you what my son is like, because I think it matters. He was a good boy. I mean that sincerely. He was gentle as a child, the kind of kid who cried when we had to put the dog down, who wrote his teachers thank you notes at the end of the school year, who called me every Sunday after his mother passed. I thought I knew him. I thought I had watched him become a good man. What I didn't see, what I understand now I should have seen, was the slow change that came after he married her. Her name is Claudette. She'd come into his life about 4 years ago, quick and bright and charming in the way some people are when they want something. She'd swept through his apartment, through his habits, through his friendships, one by one, quietly. The things and people he'd had before her became inconvenient. I'd noticed that I was seeing him less. I told myself it was just the natural drift of a man who'd found his person. I had been wrong. What I pieced together over the following weeks, through conversations with the CPS caseworker, with the detective assigned to the case, with my son himself in the awful halting phone call after he got back from Arizona, was this: Claudette had never wanted Iris. Or more precisely, she had wanted the idea of being the mother, the custody arrangement that helped her look stable in the divorce proceedings without wanting the actual child. Iris was an inconvenience, a complication, a small person who needed things and took up space, and reminded Claudette that there was a life before the one she'd constructed. My son had gone along with it, not in a dramatic, deliberate way. He'd gone along with it the way people go along with things when they are in love and don't want to see what they're looking at. Slowly, incrementally, each step small enough to seem reasonable on its own. First, Iris's door didn't have a lock. Then it did. First she ate with them, then she ate after, in the kitchen alone. First she went to school, and then this past fall, Claudette had told him the school district was switching, and they'd homeschool for a semester. The homeschooling had never started. Iris had not been to school in 4 months. The night before they left for Scottsdale, Claudette had told Iris she needed to stay in her room while they were gone. She'd left 2 bags of snacks, a case of juice boxes, and instructions not to open the door for anyone. She'd engaged the bolt from the outside. Then they'd gone to their resort. My son told me on the phone that he hadn't known about the bolt. He told me he thought his wife had made arrangements. He told me he thought a neighbor was checking in. I listened. I let him finish. Then I said, she was 7 years old, and there was a plastic bin in the corner of that room. He didn't say anything after that for a long time. I'm not here to tell you I forgave him easily. I'm not here to tell you some clean story about a father who stood by his son through everything. The truth is messier than that. The truth is, I spent a lot of nights that fall, sitting in my kitchen with a cup of coffee, gone cold, trying to figure out how my boy had become someone who could let this happen. Whether there was a version of him I'd missed, some crack in the foundation I should have caught. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That afternoon, when the officers finished, Miss Patterson came and sat across from me at the kitchen table. Iris was in the living room with another caseworker, watching something on a tablet they'd brought. Mr. Callahan, Miss Patterson said, do you have capacity to take temporary placement of the child while this is sorted out? I said yes before she finished the sentence. Iris came home with me that evening. She sat in the front seat of my truck. I asked her if she wanted to ride in the front, and her eyes went wide like I'd offered her something extraordinary, like it was a treat. And she looked out the window the whole drive without saying much. When we pulled into my driveway, she looked at the house and then she looked at me. Do you have a dog? She asked. I told her I had a cat. Old Tabby, named Biscuit, 15 years old, moved slow and slept in a patch of sun on the kitchen floor most of the day. She nodded seriously. Okay, she said, like she'd made a decision. The first thing she did when she walked in was find Biscuit. She sat down on the floor next to him very carefully and put one hand lightly on his back. He looked up at her. Biscuit never looks up for anything anymore. That cat is practically comatose. And he started to purr. I stood in my kitchen doorway and I thought, she's going to be all right. Eventually, she's going to be all right. My son and his wife came back from Arizona 2 days later. They did not come home to the house they'd left. They came home to a notice from CPS, a message from a detective, and a series of calls from my attorney, who I'd hired the morning after Iris came to stay with me. I didn't want to need a lawyer. I needed a lawyer. Claudette hired one first, her position, and this is the part that made my attorney actually laugh out loud, quietly, and without humor when I told him, was that Iris had been left in a safe and familiar environment, and that the situation had been misunderstood. She argued that the bolt was a safety measure, that the snacks were adequate, that a week was not a long time. She argued this with a straight face to a CPS caseworker who had photographs of a plastic bin used as a bathroom. My son did not argue. He came to my house 2 days after getting back. He stood at my door and he looked like he hadn't slept since Arizona, and honestly, at that point, good. He should not have been sleeping. I let him in. I made coffee. Iris was in the backyard and could see us through the kitchen window, and I told her she didn't have to come inside if she didn't want to. She stayed outside. He sat at my table, the same table where I'd had countless Sunday dinners with him, where he'd done his high school homework, where we'd sat the night his mother died, and he put his head in his hands. I didn't know about the bolt, Dad, he said. You knew about the room, I said. He didn't argue with that. You knew she wasn't in school, I said. You knew she wasn't eating with you. You knew something was wrong for a long time, and you decided not to know it all the way. He looked up at me. His eyes were red. I love Claudette. I know you do, I said. And that's on you to figure out. But that little girl out there in my backyard is 7 years old, and she's been invisible in her own home for a year, and you let that happen. You don't get to cry about that in my kitchen without knowing that I know that. He nodded. He didn't try to make it smaller. We didn't speak much after that. He left after about an hour. He didn't ask to see Iris. I don't know if that was out of shame or because he thought she wouldn't want to see him. Maybe both. The legal process was not fast. It was not clean. These things never are. But here is what happened, and I'll give you the important parts. Claudette was charged with child endangerment and child neglect. Both are felonies in this state. Her attorney negotiated. The DA did not give away much. She pled guilty to one count of child neglect, one count of reckless endangerment of a minor. She was sentenced to 18 months in a minimum security facility and 3 years probation. She served 14 months. My son was charged as well, not for the bolt, not for Scottsdale, but for the months of neglect that preceded it. The homeschooling that never started. The medical appointments Iris hadn't had in over a year. He pled guilty to one count of negligent child endangerment and received 2 years probation, mandatory counseling, and lost all parental rights over Iris, though he had never legally adopted her. So the parental rights in question were the informal custodial arrangement that had existed since the marriage. Iris's biological father in Portland was notified. He flew out. He sat in Miss Patterson's office. He cried, and from everything I was told, the crying was real. But he also had a one-bedroom apartment, a girlfriend, a 4-month-old baby, and a job that required him to travel 2 weeks out of every month. He was not equipped. He knew he was not equipped. He and I had a phone call, long one. Uncomfortable in the way that honest conversations between people in impossible situations tend to be. He asked me what I thought was best for Iris. I said I thought she needed stability, a school she recognized, a house she already knew. I told him Biscuit the cat was an asset. He laughed at that, a tired, genuine laugh. He agreed to a guardianship arrangement. He has full parental rights. He comes out every few months to see her. They're building something. It's slow, but it's real. Last Thanksgiving, he stayed for 4 days and I made a turkey that was honestly too big for 3 people and a child. And we played board games until Iris fell asleep on the couch. I became Iris's legal guardian 11 months after the day Mitch the plumber called me. That first year was hard in the way that good hard things are. The kind of hard that costs you something real, but gives you something realer back. I am 64 years old. I raised one child already. I know how to read a chapter book aloud with different voices for each character, but I had forgotten how much patience it takes when a child wakes up from a nightmare. I had forgotten how much of parenting is just being a warm, steady presence in a room. Just being there. Iris started second grade that September. She'd missed so much that her teacher, a sturdy, no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Abrams, who I decided within 10 minutes of meeting her was exactly the right person for this, kept her after school twice a week to catch up. By December, she was reading at grade level. By March, she joined the after-school art club and made a best friend named Callie, who lives 3 streets over and thinks Biscuit is the greatest cat in the history of cats. She wasn't wrong. Iris doesn't talk much about what happened. She's in therapy. Dr. Nguyen, who is excellent and who Iris initially called the feelings doctor in a tone that made clear she found the concept mildly ridiculous and then grew to trust completely, and from what Dr. Nguyen tells me, she's processing at her own pace, in her own way. She calls me Pop. I didn't ask her to. One afternoon in October, she just did, and she looked at me sideways when she said it, like she was testing the word in the air, and I kept my face very neutral so she wouldn't see how it hit me. I called my son twice that first year. He was in counseling. He'd moved into a smaller place after Claudette went to prison. They were still technically married, but I didn't ask and he didn't explain. He asked about Iris. I told him she was doing well. He said he was glad. Neither of us had much more than that. I don't know what we'll do with each other in the long run. That's the part of the story I don't have yet. What I have is this. A Tuesday morning routine where Iris eats her cereal and argues that the bus is always early even when it isn't, and Biscuit sits on the windowsill watching the yard. And I drink my coffee and listen to her argue and think about how much of life you can miss if you're not paying attention. I paid attention to a plumber's phone call on a Tuesday in October. It is the most important phone call I have ever received. There are children in houses on every street in this country who are invisible, not because no one could see them, but because the adults around them decided, in small ways and large ways, not to look. I was one of those adults. I am telling you this without flinching, because I think you need to know it. I missed a year of that little girl's life that I will never give back to her. What I can give her is the rest of it. And she is out in the backyard right now, chasing a squirrel that she will absolutely never catch, laughing anyway, and Biscuit is watching from the window like a retired emperor, observing his kingdom. And it is an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, and it is the best thing I have ever seen. I think about Mitch a lot. A plumber who showed up to fix a kitchen sink and instead made a phone call that changed a little girl's life. He didn't have to call me. He could have finished his work, collected his check, and told himself it wasn't his business. A lot of people would have done exactly that. But he didn't. And I think that says something worth sitting with, that doing the right thing rarely announces itself as a grand moment. It usually shows up disguised as an uncomfortable choice on an ordinary Tuesday morning. What happened to Iris didn't happen because of one monstrous decision. It happened the way most damage happens, gradually, in small surrenders. My son didn't wake up one day and decide to fail that child. He just decided over and over in quiet ways not to look too closely, not to ask the question whose answer he suspected. That kind of not looking takes a certain intelligence in reverse, a deliberate dimming of what you know to protect what you want. And the cost of it always is paid by whoever is most vulnerable in the room. Claudette knew what she was doing. I believe that. But my son knew something was wrong long before a bolt appeared on a door. The failure of character isn't always in the doing. Sometimes it's in the long, practiced choosing not to see. I was part of that too. I had been to that house. I had noticed, vaguely, that I never really saw Iris. I had told myself there was an explanation. I was a retired man who didn't want to make trouble in his son's marriage, and that passivity, that comfortable, polite, well-intentioned looking away, had its own consequences. I don't let myself off the hook for it. I'm 64 years old and I know better, and I knew better then. What pulled everything into the light wasn't a system. It wasn't a school or a social worker or a neighbor. It was one man with a wrench and a conscience who decided that a child's crying was not something he could unhear. Iris is proof that resilience isn't something children are born with or aren't. It's something that grows when the right conditions exist. When someone shows up consistently, when safety becomes something a child can count on instead of something she has to wonder about each morning. She works hard at school now. She asks questions constantly about everything, the way kids do when they finally feel safe enough to be curious. That kind of intellectual hunger doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from finally having enough ground under your feet to reach for something. I am not a perfect guardian. I forget things. I am too old to remember every form that needs signing. Some mornings the routine defeats me before 8 a.m., but I show up. Every day I show up. Every day I show up. And I think that is what the story is really about. Not the crime, not the courtroom, not the sentence. It's about whether you show up for the people who need you before someone has to call you in a shaking voice to tell you they're already in trouble. Iris chased that squirrel again this morning. Still didn't catch it. Still laughed. That's enough for me.